we can characterize the Western response led by the United States to the Soviet Union's uh, expansionist strategy as as consisting of three pillars. All right, so it's kind of like a three-legged stool, if you could think about it that way, right? And the three pillars or the three legs of this stool are uh, are ideological, economic, and military. All right. So let me just go through these, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about events that happened in Europe that caused these responses to be formulated. Okay, the first one has to do with the idea of expanding communism. All right, so one of the things that happens after World War II is that even though the war had been won by the Western countries, there was a lot of economic unrest in all throughout Europe because Europe had been devastated by the war, and particularly in southeastern Europe, there is a lot of unrest and a lot of poverty, and there are Soviet, or I should say, communist um, movements, revolutionary movements in both Greece and Turkey, as well as other places, and there is a fear that the Soviets are supporting the communist revolutionaries, obviously, and there's a fear that if the West doesn't respond to that, then then they will fall to communism. All right, and so what happens then is that the um, the President Truman will go to Congress and ask for money to support these um, the regimes in Greece and Turkey, keeping in mind that he's phrasing his support for the governments in Greece and Turkey as a support for democracy, because this is what drives American foreign policy. American foreign policy is to support democracy. The problem is that neither one of these countries are democratic countries. But it doesn't matter, because what happens is that out of that debate, I guess you could say, comes what we call the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine is that the United States will oppose the spread of communism anywhere. All right. So that's the first pillar, the ideological pillar that says that the United States will oppose the spread of communism everywhere. It doesn't mean that the United States is going to try to defeat communism, but it means that it won't allow it to spread. Okay, questions, comments about that? All right, the second part then is again there are many people. Well, let's look at it this way. Let's go back to when we were talking about the Depression. And one of the problems with the Depression was that people were starving. People didn't have what they needed to live, and they were afraid that they weren't going to be able to get what they needed to live. And so, one of the solutions that many people thought would be appropriate was um, communism or socialism. And we saw, for example, in the United States, that some people thought socialism was going to be a good idea. And recall that I told you before, the only time socialism seems like a good idea is when you don't have anything, because it's about sharing, right? If you don't have, listen, the example I always use is, if you have a car and I don't have a car, then I think you should lend me your car. But if I have a car and you don't have a car, I think you should get your own car. You see what I'm saying? And that's the idea. The kind of appeal of socialism is that when nobody has anything, then the idea of sharing everything seems like a good idea. And that was a situation in Europe and many other places in the world after World War II, that the economies had been devastated. And so there was a fear on the part of the West, particularly the Americans, that if this economic crisis wasn't addressed, that that there was a real possibility that people in Europe would actually vote their way into communism. And so what happened was that the United States decided to or proposed a conference. They called together all of the former participants in the war, including the Soviet Union and the Eastern, what they call the Warsaw Pact countries, right? To that, what the United States basically said was, you guys come up with a plan for economic recovery and tell us how much it's going to cost, and we'll give you the money. Okay, so that obviously the Eastern Bloc didn't participate because the whole point of it was to defeat communism. But the Western countries, that's most of these other countries, come together and they come up with a plan for economic recovery, and the United States actually gives them the money. It's called the Marshall Plan because it was announced by Secretary of State Marshall um, in 1947. But the idea is to bring about economic recovery in Western Europe so that communism no longer seems like a good solution. And this is probably the single most successful American foreign policy initiative ever, because the United States forked over the money, but within just a few months, the economy of Western Europe starts to rebound, and the result of it is going to be that the appeal of socialism lessens. It kind of vanishes. You guys are with me on this? So that's going to be the second pillar then, the economic pillar, that the United States helps to rebuild the economy of Western Europe, including Germany, um, for the purpose of making communism, socialism less attractive, and it worked. Okay, you guys are with me? Questions, comments about that? Okay, the final one actually ends up being the military one, and here's where we can kind of see where it comes from. During the Potsdam Conference, uh, the Americans and the Soviets and the Germans and the French basically had divided Berlin into four different zones of occupation. All right. At the end of the war, Berlin was about 100 miles behind the Russian lines, or I should say east of the Russian lines. Right. Okay. So basically, then what happened was that the city of Berlin is connected to West Germany by a single road and an air corridor. And at the Potsdam Conference, they divided Berlin into four different zones of occupation, which eventually will be consolidated into two, East and West Berlin. East Berlin will be controlled by the Soviets, or the East German Communist Party. West Berlin will be controlled by the Western Allies. Basically, it will be controlled by the German government in West Germany, but it's an island in the middle of a sea of communism, essentially. So again, we have this half of a city that is 100 miles inside the Soviet territory, connected only by a single road and an air corridor. Okay, and and at the end of the war, both sides, the Soviets and the West, contemplated continuing the war. Churchill basically said that the West should immediately declare war on the Soviets to take over the rest of Europe, because if they didn't, they would be in conflict with them for a long time, which turned out to be true, right? But people were done with war. They didn't want any more war, so they stopped. But nevertheless, the Soviets still thought that there may be some benefit to stressing the Western alliance or the Western powers militarily. And so one thing that happens then is that the Soviets will close the road between West Germany and West Berlin. And the reason some people say that the road is closed is that they're provoking the West, that Stalin was provoking the West, provoking an attack by the West, saying that the West, hoping that the West would then use military force to try to reopen the road, which would then lead to further conflict, which at which point then Stalin would hope that he could take the rest of Europe. You guys are following me here? Okay, does that make sense? You guys got that? But that's not what happened. What happened instead was that the West mounted an airlift. You guys have heard of it, the Berlin airlift, right? And the Berlin, what they did was that they started to supply everything that was needed in West Berlin by air. So there was a constant airlift of goods from the West into Berlin, which lasted almost a year. And then at the end of that year, the Soviets reopened the road, and this situation then remained until the 1990s. Okay, but what it showed was that the Soviets were a military threat in Western Europe. And so what happened was that the United States formed an alliance called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, right? And this alliance was essentially all the green countries. And the purpose of the alliance was to oppose the spread of Soviet expansion in Western Europe. Okay, so that's the third leg. Then the third leg of the strategy is the military leg. So we have ideological. The United States will oppose the spread of communism everywhere. Economic. The United States will help to rebuild the economy of Western Europe so that communism doesn't seem to be attractive. And military, meaning that the West would stand strong against Soviet military expansion in Europe. Okay, you guys are with me? Questions, comments? Now, one of the things are there any questions? You guys got this? All right. So one thing that you'll notice is that I've been talking about Europe, right? And we think of the Cold War as being a worldwide conflict, which it was, right? Here's where we're going to see a problem, right? The problem is that the conflict in Europe ends up being, I think that you can actually contain it within the rhetoric, the language of the Cold War, right? So the Cold War basically was a fundamental contest between socialism and capitalism. But the rest of the world was under a different set of pressures. Okay, and let me just kind of show you here where we see the Cold War happening is in the Northern Hemisphere, right? And where we see the Southern Hemisphere, I should say, the Southern Hemisphere is experiencing a different crisis. And this crisis is known as decolonization. Between 1945 and 1965, all of the countries that were colonized by Europe in the Southern Hemisphere are going to become independent. The problem is that when they become independent, their economies will be crippled by a century or more of colonialism. Because the colonial powers ruled these countries and dominated these countries for the benefit of extracting value. So all of the infrastructure and all of the economies are set up to provide wealth to the mother countries, to the colonizing powers, but not for the people of the colonies. And so, what will happen then is that many of these colonies are going to be struggling, or I should say, many of these independent countries now are going to be struggling with collapsed economies, and some of them are going to think that socialism might not be a bad idea. Okay, so um, so as I mentioned to you guys, if you don't have anything, then socialism seems like a good idea, right? And what will happen then is that those countries will be targets of the Soviets in terms of their strategy of spreading communism. Because basically what ends up happening then is that the process of decolonization essentially gets intertwined with the process of the Cold War. And so what ends up happening is that both the Soviets and the Western Alliance will see these struggling countries as opportunities for expanding their influence. And basically what will end up happening is that these countries that were formerly colonized will be asked to make a choice by both the United States and the Soviet Union to choose what side they're on. Because the way that the world looked to the Soviets and the Americans was that there were only two things, only two worlds. There was the first world, which was the American world, and then there was the second world, which was the communist world. Okay, you guys are with me? And both of these are saying you have to choose. You have to be on one side or the other. Okay, you guys get it? Well, the problem is that, I should say it this way. Well, we can call it a problem, I guess. Some countries, starting with India, India was ruled by a man named Nehru. And Nehru realized that neither the Soviet Union nor the United States were really interested in their benefit. Both of them were interested in the expansion of their own influence, but neither of them was really interested in the benefit of the formerly colonized countries. And so what Nehru did was he proposed a third alternative called the non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement, what it means is that these countries are not aligned with either the Soviets or the Americans. You guys get what I'm saying? These countries are saying, we're not going to choose a side. We're going to stay out of it because what your conflict is has nothing to do with our crisis, essentially. And so that's where we see the beginning, the creation of what's called the third world. All right. The first world is the American and their alliance. The second world is the communist bloc. The third world is all of those countries that refuse to choose. Okay. And so one of the things that we'll notice then, if I asked you what is a third world country, how do you know something is a third world country? How would you respond? What
Typically,
characterizes a third world country?
the
Like
way that I learned it is just like countries that are less developed.
Countries that are less developed, okay, and that results in what?
it's like technology and like I guess military expansion on top of that, but like economic power.
Okay, so if they're not developed, then what are they
Impossible.
economically? They're poor, right? When we think about third world countries, they say any place where it's poor, they say what's a third world country, right? And the reason for that is because all of these countries that were not aligned were poor, right? but they were not aligned because they were not called the third world because they were poor. They were called the third world because they were not aligned. You guys get what I'm saying? So third world doesn't necessarily, or at least originally, didn't mean just poor countries. It meant countries that were not engaged in the Cold War. You guys are with me? So the only reason why it's important for you to know that is that when you're at your next academic cocktail party and somebody brings up the third world, you could say, oh, did you know? So I'm sure you guys go to those parties, right? All right. So at any rate, so that's the main thing that we want to point out here is that there's basically two different major processes happening at the same time between 1964, or actually between 1945 and going on at least to the middle of the 60s, right? And that is the Cold War, essentially in the Northern Hemisphere, and decolonization in the Southern Hemisphere. Okay, you guys are with me? And what's going to happen, the tragedy is going to be that the superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, are going to see decolonization only in terms of their own ideological conflict. And the result's going to be that the United States, for example, will look at, for example, in Guatemala. In Guatemala, they're going to establish a socialist government that's not influenced by the Soviets, but the Americans, as soon as they see socialism, will say, aha, Moscow. And so the United States will oppose them, right? And the result then will be where the United States could recognize the poverty that's trying to be addressed and assist. Instead, they make them into enemies. You follow what I'm saying here? And this is going to be the problem that we're going to see it really everywhere, but the most painful place we're going to see it is going to be in Vietnam, right? Because the people of Vietnam want to be free of French colonialism, but they don't particularly want to be communist. But the United States will see the struggle only in terms of communism versus capitalism or democracy, how the Americans say it. And as a result of that, will, instead of trying to uplift the Vietnamese people, they'll bomb them. And we'll just see how that goes, right? So anyway, questions, comments about any of that?